Welcome. Today we are delighted to be in conversation with artists Tyler Hobbs and Casey Reas. My name is Dyhandra Lawson. I'm a curator of contemporary art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and we're delighted to be in conversation hosted by Unit London. Tyler Hobbs is an artist based in Texas who typically works with algorithms, plotters, and paint. He develops and programs custom algorithms that are used to generate visual imagery. His practice examines aesthetics generated by computer hardware and software, and how those aesthetics tell us about our world around us and who we are. He earned a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science from the University of Texas at Austin. Casey Reas is an artist and a professor at the University of California, Los Angeles. He co-founded Processing, a free open source coding language for visual art in 2001, as well as the Processing Foundation, an organization committed to promoting software literacy within the visual arts and technology fields. His organization is particularly interested in creating educational opportunities for people who have been historically excluded or who do not have access to programming education. His work ranges from small works on paper to city-scale installations, and he's collaborated with architects and musicians. Reas earned his Master of Fine Arts from MIT. Both artists exhibit internationally and are represented in international public collections, including LACMA's. And in fact, recent collaborations and acquisitions with the artists and the museum kind of bring us into conversation today. So Tyler and Casey, thank you again for being on this panel. I think there's a lot of shared themes between the work that I hope we can discover together today. I think, Tyler, we'll start with the recent acquisition that's just come into the museum. We've been very excited to accept these two artworks, Discrete Affection #3 and Connected for the Moment #1, from the body of work Mechanical Hand. What you see is a drawing, a charcoal on paper on the left, and a media file that's been delivered to the museum as a non-fungible token on the right. Hobbs, you began working on this series in late 2002, and you completed it last year in 2023. Mm-hmm. So I wonder, Tyler, if you can kind of, just to open the floor and conversation, tell us a little bit about these works, particularly interested in sort of the difference between coding natural observation, as you've kind of set up this juxtaposition or polarity, if you think of it as a polarity, between these two artworks.
Absolutely. And yeah, Dyhandra, first, let me just say thank you very much for having me and giving me an opportunity to talk about this work. I always, love to talk about this and kind of get into some of the ideas that motivate me to make this work. As you mentioned, these two works were both part of a body of work called Mechanical Hand that I exhibited at Unit London in 2023. And really the core theme of that show was looking at the machine and the hands and their differences and ways that we can work with both of those together, how they can each bring their own unique strengths and qualities and characteristics. And so each of the works in that show kind of examines and explored that relationship in a little bit of a different way. And of course, these two works really fit into that theme as well. At a high level, one of the most obvious differences between the analog world and the digital world is around perfection and imperfection. Everything in the analog world is really imperfect by default. To make anything perfect requires an extraordinary amount of effort, and you can really never get to true perfection. There's always something off. Nothing is perfectly straight. Nothing is perfectly even or perfectly filled. And when we look at things in the digital realm, especially things, produced algorithmically, it's really the opposite of that by default. Computers, hardware and software are really geared towards making straight lines, working with grids, filling things evenly. Mistakes don't just happen. not in the same way that they do in the algorithmic world. And so really there you have to labor to get from perfect to imperfect. So it's quite a different relationship between the artist and the material. And both of these works really explore that theme in particular. So discrete affection, the work on the left, that's the charcoal on paper. This was a series of 4 small drawings that I produced. And the designs for these were first created algorithmically. So I constructed an algorithm that really just produced the core shapes and lines that you see in the image. And of course, that algorithm involved randomness as it normally does in my process. But I chose to work with shapes that were very, native to the computer. So very simple rectangles with an even fill and, straight lines. And I used the plotter to very gently transfer this digital design onto paper using a pencil. And from there, I finished the drawing using charcoal by hand. And what I was really interested in there was using the hand, which is fallible, and charcoal, a medium, which is particularly messy and imperfect, and kind of combining that imperfection in the physical process with a sort of more perfect design coming from the computer. And I'm really interested in the way that enriches and enlivens the design that can be kind of cold and clinical coming out of the computer. So to me, it's really interesting how those imperfections sometimes are what make a work feel more human or relatable in some way. At the very least, to me, they add a lot of extra richness that gives us a reason to look up close and to appreciate things. So I was interested in that transformation of, taking the really computer-esque design and making it more human that way. Connected for the Moments kind of goes the opposite direction. This came out of a series of algorithmic studies that I did of lines drawn by hands. And I was interested in how when we draw a line by hand, it's never perfectly straight. And I was interested in the ways that it tends to deviate away from being perfectly straight. So even though there's this sort of like error or imperfection, there's almost always a type of systematic behavior to that, right? Like the arm and the hands has particular joints and tendons and muscles that cause it to tend to err in certain ways. And so really I was interested in algorithmically examining the flaws that tend to come in hand-drawn lines. And so I built a simple algorithmic model for that, and really just use that as one of the core building blocks for this algorithm. So yeah, this is sort of looking at imperfection through a digital and algorithmic lens. So both of these works address the same topic, but from different directions.
Just listening to your sort of description and, reflection on the work, I'm dwelling on the word analog and digital, these words, and how they're kind of always set up in language as these opposites. And I'm wondering how we experience analog and digital contemporaneously, and if in fact they actually are opposites. What does it mean to introduce flaws into the algorithm? Like, what does that look like for you as the programmer, the artist, to introduce a flaw into the computer?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think flaw is almost really a misnomer. If you're looking at it from that direction, I use the word flaw all the time, but really it's about richness and complexity. So one of the ways I like to think about this is maybe from kind of a information perspective. So you think about how much information it takes to represent, say, a perfect rectangle with straight lines. It takes almost just a tiny little bit of information to represent that. But if you were to try to fully accurately capture kind of the data of a hand-drawn rectangle with all the little wobbles and detours that inevitably happen there, it's a much more complex shape that you're dealing with. It's a much richer piece of information, and there's almost like an infinite level of detail there that happens in the analog world, right? You can you can zoom in and zoom in and zoom in, and there's always something more to explore. And in the digital world, that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen by default, at least. You have to work very deliberately and intentionally to achieve something like that. As you zoom in, you start to lose detail and you start to lose richness. It doesn't happen on its own. So if you're interested in having that level of detail and that level of richness, it has to be something that you think about explicitly, and that you have to add to the algorithm explicitly. At that point, it's, you can't really call it a flaw or a mistake or an error. It's more about kind of micro enrichments in some sense, I would say. I don't know. Casey, what do you think?
Yeah, I think when you're making a drawing, it takes extra care, extra effort, and acuity to make a straight line. And when you're working with software code or on a digital machine, it takes extra care, extra energy to make a wobbly line. And so I think that's an interesting thing that you've really expressed through this pair.
And Tyler, you called the body of work mechanical hand, and so there seems to be a really intentional interest in hand and body, and so did you make the drawing first?
I think they happened. Kind of both of them happened over a period of months. Some pieces of the algorithm maybe came together before I did the drawing, and then I think I finished the drawing, and then I finished the algorithm connected for the moment after that. And also, like I said, to find ways to combine the strengths of each of those, and to allow the computer to do what it excels at, and allow the hand to do what it excels at, and to look at ways to combine the two of those.
I think that's a really interesting thing about your work, Tyler, is that you've maintained a connection to working with pigments, working with your hands. And I think most artists who work with software, work with code, either never worked with their hands or they sort of traded one for the other. I think that's a unique thing about the work you do.
Tyler, I wonder if you, I'm just thinking of kind of the aspect or the component that seems integral to generative art, which is the component of the surprise, right? Like there's the staging of the parameters, and then kind of the unknown output. Do you find that in drawing?
Really, it's a spectrum, and it depends on which medium you're talking about. So, for example, if you're talking about something like pen or pencil, where it's relatively clean and controlled, then there's not going to be a lot of surprise coming just from the materials themselves. But if you switch to, say, watercolor, then you suddenly do have quite a bit more of an element of surprise. It's just you're releasing a certain amount of control physically over exactly what's going to happen. And of course, you can imagine a whole spectrum of other materials and processes that the artist might use to potentially sort of relieve themselves of some of that aspect of control over the work, and to create an element of surprise. Of course, we can also look historically at artists who have done exactly that. You can go back to Dada, for example, and artists starting to incorporate randomness and processes like dropping scraps of paper onto a canvas in order to create that element of surprise. So certainly, when you're explicitly working as a generative artist, that's much more front of mind, center of mind. But yeah, for artists working with physical media, it definitely can be part of the process as well.
I feel like generative art and computers they work well together, but the ideas of generative art go back many, many centuries, and generative art is not an inherently computational medium, for sure. In the painting studio, I have a range of different instruments to help me apply paint in different ways. When I'm working with code, it helps me think in many, many different ways and get outside of the constraints of what I can do in my mind. It's an extension of what's possible. Like maybe instead of, if we think about John Cage and the I Ching, or we think about like rolling dice or something like that, it augments the ability to hold things and to work at different scales.
Casey, maybe we should turn to your work that recently has come into LACMA's collection. I'll just briefly show these slides and describe that this body of work, Empty Rooms, came about through a collaboration and commission with LACMA that was in connection with our exhibition last year, Coded Art Enters the Computer Age, 1952 to 1982. So it was a look at computer art before the internet. And this was a two-part digital work, which both simulated and paid tribute to Victor Vasarely's unrealized proposal for LACMA's Art and Technology program. And for audience members who aren't familiar with LACMA's Art and Tech program, it was a program proposed by a former curator, Maurice Tuchman, who was in 1967, who was interested in what would happen if you gave artists the opportunity to work with different technology or computer or corporate firms, if you will. And Victor Vasarely submitted a proposal, which he was not able to realize. But it was at a moment when Vasarely was interested in cybernetics and permutation. And the proposal, he described a machine that was composed of lights arranged in a grid that would generate millions of different visual patterns related to his paintings. And so these are screen prints that I think conceptually convey his work and his ideas. But then KCU then, for Coded, was thinking about Vasarely's work, this particular proposal, and created empty rooms and metaversely at LACMA. So I wonder if you could just talk a bit about the project. And I'm curious how your initial instincts to Vasarely's work changed or developed as then you got deeper into the practice of making the work.
Thank you. Can we go to the Vasarely slide really quick?
Yeah.
So this folklore image in particular was the work of this era was really influential on this. And Vasarely talked about this plastic language, and a lot of this work was made was made numerically in the studio, where you can assign a number to a square, assign a number to the downward triangle, assign a number to each color. And so by working with permutations of those different numeric values, those would get translated into an image. So he was working in a essentially digital way. What I was thinking about in doing this work was taking the spirit of that enterprise, but thinking about it in terms of digital images, raster-based images that exist on screen. So the thing about a digital image is that it's discrete, that it's made up of these individual elements. And so here, the first step was to create what I call a still life image. I think it's still life for working with software and code rather than working with apples and oranges and flowers. The still life is working with these fundamental elements. So this idea of a circle, the idea of a triangle. So making these still life images and then taking it apart according to the way that it was constructed. So for every single pixel in the image, to take the numeric values of that, like going back to Vasarely's idea of encoding shapes with numbers, instead of working with things on the level of the shape, working with the level of each color value in the digital image and exploding that out. And so that was the line from Vasarely into these empty room-based pieces. And for the here projected into the gallery, there were 3 projections side by side, each was running the same piece of software. One thing about this work, and a reason that I continue to work with software and code, is that every time I would walk into the gallery, I wouldn't know what was going to be there. There was something unexpected. And sometimes things would sort of by chance line up in a certain way. That was sort of a unchoreographed moment. And then at other times, things would be transitioning through. This idea of the unexpected and chance was really built into the work.
I'm interested in what you were saying about, with Tyler too, we were talking about this element of surprise and the unknown, walking into the room and then seeing as we can in this slide of how the shapes are kind of coming together. And it reminded me of some quotes and insights that Agnes Martin has shared about her work, particularly this body of work on a clear day that she made in the 70s upon moving to New Mexico after living in the bustling New York for nearly a decade, where she was a successful artist. But when she approached on a clear day, sort of creating this seemingly perfect grid. She remarked, subtle moments of happiness that we all experience, the concrete representation of our most subtle feelings. And so, of course, this is not a perfect grid or not a perfect square or rectangle. Our eyes may optically experience it that way, and perhaps a wave of relief or pleasure or subtle happiness can kind of wash over us. And so I just wonder if that's something that you kind of relate to, that insight with Agnes's work.
Yes. I think one thing that's always something on my mind is this idea of tuning. And I think with code, sometimes I can get almost all the way there in like a few weeks, but then I spend months just like tuning, just like modifying the smallest little pieces. And that sort of brings it into like what's musical analogies that kind of like allows it to resonate. And I think that when we look at these drawings from Agnes Martin, it's that tuning, it's that slight difference that I think really makes the work resonate with me.
I have to comment on this because Agnes Martin is like probably my single favorite artist, and this body of work is just such a great example of an artist working with the generative mindset at a time before we had that terminology for it. You know, she's very clearly exploring the different variables of how you can construct a grid, right? What's the width? What's the height? Is there a border? Is there not a border? Are there vertical lines or not? She explores all of those, and as Casey's saying, like she very much tunes or curates, however you want to think about that, but she really finds the best examples from that very large potential space of how exactly you can draw a grid. But yeah, to me, it's really wonderful seeing work like this from an amazing artist like Agnes Martin and thinking about it through a generative lens. It's in some ways it's hard for me to say what it is that makes these so successful. I think Agnes Martin said that these works were innocent, I think is the word that she used to describe them. And I think that's great. Like they drop any sort of preconception, they drop any sort of delusion of grandeur on the part of the artist. Like they're as simple and as straightforward as they can be, but they're obviously, you know, balanced and harmonious and just have this like wonderful harmony, to me at least. And I don't know, maybe I have a slightly complicated relationship with computers that in some ways, if you made exactly this same work with the computer, it kind of can lose its charm. It's almost like you can see the energy that it took Agnes Martin to get to this simple point, and it's maybe not there when you come at it from the origin of the computer. I'm not sure. Thinking
about sort of, you know, cross-generational or intergenerational cross-media inspirations. You both met, as I understand, almost a decade ago, 7 years ago or so, through a rotoscope workshop. Is that correct?
But one thing that was interesting about that was that it was art students and computer science students, and they kind of everybody came in the first day, and we just like randomly mixed them. And so they needed to find a way to kind of work together.
And you both collaborated on this project, right? This was Casey, you curated through Ferrophile. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you guys can just speak to this collaboration and what you were thinking about in this work.
Yeah, so this work, maybe not surprising based on some of the other themes that we already covered. I was, again, really interested in combinations of the hand and the machine and in the relation between the real world, the analog world, and the digital world. And I was interested in the sort of transformation that objects undergo through different artistic processes. So I did drawings by hand of a collection of different birds, and then I kind of created a custom software process to allow me to sort of vectorize those drawings, turn those drawings into data that I could then import into an algorithm and process those algorithmically, manipulate them. And then the work was finalized and executed through the use of a plotter. So I used the plotter with a pen to actually take the algorithmic output and to draw it back onto paper. And so almost everything involved in this work has gone through sort of multiple layers of translation. You have this kind of shift from the hand to the machine, back to the physical world. And I'm always interested in trying to like create work that moves across that boundary, that really tries to blend elements of the hand and the machine, or the analog world and the digital world. To me, we spend so much time in both worlds really at this point, that I'm interested in artwork that has something to say about both of them.
Really, really beautiful. And also kind of bringing the digital world into sort of languages of motion studies. I'm kind of eager also, Casey, to look at some of your more recent explorations with the moving image. This is a study for a garden of earthly delights, which you made in 2018, and an excerpt of some of your explorations of moving image.
Yeah, this is very much like a meta Brackage. And the idea was that Stan Brackage made these two films, Mothlight and Garden of Earthly Delights, which were made by collaging organic plant material onto clear film leader and then making optical prints from that. And so I did a residency at this time, 2018, out in Colorado, which is the same biome where Brackage was living when he made these films. I went out foraging on the mountainside, brought back all these natural materials. And then the idea of this sketch was, let's think about this idea of making a film, but with digital media. And so I composed everything on a flatbed scanner, and then scanned everything really high resolution, and then basically wrote a simple piece of code that took that high-res scan and chunked it into individual frames, and then put those frames together at 12 frames per second. And this was the result. So I was thinking both about Brackage, I was thinking about early Man Ray, and this was like one of, I think, 6 different sketches that I made at that time. And then these sketches became a series of tens of thousands of images, every frame from these video sketches that were used to train a machine learning model for a work that was just recently up at Unit until about last Saturday was the closing of that show.
I mean, there's no tidy way to sum or synthesize our conversation, but I do find in both of your works sort of this idea of subverting the expectations of the material.
Well, I think there's this idea that has been around since its origins, that computer has no place in art making. And I think my approach, and I feel Tyler's approach too, is that like this is just an extension of thousands of years of art history, and this is just sort of flowing in that river together. And let's look at everything. Software is more interesting when we look at it in relationship to film and painting. It's a lot less interesting if we just think about it as an isolated element.
Thinking about if the practice is digital or virtual, then why make the tangible object? Mm-hmm. Like what is the impulse for the object?
I mean, I'd love to answer this because I definitely think about it a lot as well. To me, I think part of the answer is about the nature of our existence right now. So maybe we spend 8 hours a day in a digital environment like this. We're on Zoom right now, recording through a computer screen, but we still have physical bodies. We still have all these different physical senses, and in many ways, artwork that can fully utilize all the senses of the body can be more powerful and more impactful. There's also this topic of analog richness, which I talked about at the beginning, right? Like digital work, as it currently stands, has a hard time competing with the level of richness that we can sometimes achieve with physical materials. I'm always interested in work that is able to address both of those. And yeah, there's advantages and disadvantages to both, but that's why I find it meaningful to sometimes still have physical components to work, even if it's algorithmic at the core.
Yeah, I'm really interested in how they form a dialogue with each other, how these things I do with my hand, with drawing, change radically what I'm doing with code and vice versa. And I'm really interested in pushing them both as far as they can go. I think there's tremendous amount to explore and to feel in both ways. And like when I was a younger artist, a younger coder, I was on the side of like, I'm never going to make anything with my hand ever again. Everything has to be industrialized. Everything has to be like machine produced. And that's where I was for, about 15 years. And I've really moved strongly away from that recently.
Well, thank you both so much for your thoughtfulness and openness today and this conversation, and illuminating shared and also disparate themes in your work. And it's been a real pleasure to think about your work in relationship to what it means to be alive today. So thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been really delightful and thoughtful. I'll be thinking about this a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Dyhandra.